Don't teach your kids about germs. 55M/father of a 24-year-old son. I know just by the title many of you are probably discounting me as some anti-vax nutjob, but teaching my son basic high school level germ theory was the biggest mistake of my life. What I thought was an important lesson any father should teach his son ended up being a major cause of tension and tragedy in the lives of my family. It must have been the way I taught him, or the age I chose to teach it to him at. And I'm hoping either of those is true because it means that this post might prevent you from making the same mistake I did. If I'm wrong, then it just means something was inherently wrong with my son from birth, and I don't know which is worse. When my wife and I had our son, I swear I could have been counted as the happiest man on earth. I was still young at 31, but had spent my entire 20s childless, so I didn't feel like I was robbed of any youth or whatever when my wife gave me the news about her pregnancy. I swear on that day that I was going to be the best father that had ever been and would even outdo my own dad, with whom I had a very close relationship, and my son, who we will call Daniel for the sake of this post, was a remarkably easy baby. I swear he hardly ever cried, to the point where the lack of sleepless nights had my wife and I questioning if something was wrong with him. Daniel, however, was simply an unusually calm and quiet newborn. Not only would he never cry, but I can hardly remember him fussing at all or even really smiling or laughing much. He would always kind of just stare at you, with a wide-eyed, confused, almost fearful look, like he couldn't quite figure out where he was, who he was looking at, or even how to just be a baby. As he grew into a toddler, he would continue to interact with the world with this sort of reserved, cautious curiosity. I'll admit that my son's timidness bothered me. It might not be the most PC thing to say these days, but I was really worried that my son might grow up to be the soft-spoken, quiet kid, the likes of which I used to pick on in high school. In hindsight, it was ridiculous of me to be so worried about that, of all things, but I imagine every young father has an idea of who they want their son to be. We want our sons to be strong, confident, and utterly independent, even if we would give them the world. The thought of my son growing up to be anything but a Stallone-like macho man bothered me, and I was convinced that it all came down to how he spent his childhood. So as soon as he could walk, I made sure he had a lot of outdoor time and tried to encourage sports and roughhousing whenever I could. I might have been putting Daniel through some sort of baby boot camp, but I wasn't utterly delusional. While I encouraged the sort of activities that might give him bruises and so-called character building, I still cared about my son's health and was never shy with affection or care. I genuinely loved my son and wanted what was best for him, and so I decided if Daniel was going to be playing in the mud all day, he should also be taught how to keep himself from getting sick doing so. It all started with some public access kids science show that was airing at like 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Daniel wasn't watching. He was out back playing with his toy trucks and dinosaurs. He was about 5 or 6 at the time, but I was admittedly a little high and didn't feel like changing the channel. The show's host, some middle-aged guy with an eccentric bow tie and a lab coat, was showing off an experiment that could teach your children about the importance of washing their hands. The experiment was simple. The host filled a bowl of water with ground-up pepper and oregano or some other spice you could find at home. Then, he would dip his finger in the bowl and show how all the little culinary debris would stick to his skin, explaining after that the spices were like germs that latch onto your skin after you touch a surface. Then, he would wipe off his hand, apply a little household soap, and dip his finger in again, showing how much less of the debris remained before explaining that the soap molecules made the germs slippery so they couldn't stick to your skin. Or something along those lines. I was immediately excited and called Daniel in from his playtime to conduct the experiment ourselves. I never washed my hands or brushed my teeth or did any of the things you were supposed to do growing up because I felt like they weren't the big deal everyone was making them out to be. This, I thought, was the perfect way to demonstrate the idea to Daniel and would be something he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. I couldn't have known how right I'd be with Daniel at my side. I conducted the experiment eagerly just as it was shown on the television. The experiment was easy enough to recreate, albeit my explanations were much less scientific and a lot more improvised. To Daniel, it didn't seem to matter. He just stared on as I filled the bowl with water and as much pepper and parsley as I could. He had that typical, quiet kid stare he always had as I explained how germs were tiny, living things that were everywhere, even if you couldn't see them. The visual aid of the spices really seemed to paint the picture for him, because when I pulled my finger from the bowl the first time, he outright gasped at the sight of all the black particles all over my hand. Then I did it again with the soap, and explained the importance of washing your hands and how it can get rid of almost all the germs in just a few seconds of scrubbing. I waited for Daniel's reaction, and to my surprise, it was much more than his usual, cautious quiet. I could tell by looking at him that something was different. It was in his eyes, which stared sharply at my finger. They seemed to be darker than they were a moment ago. It was as if the color had drained from them as Daniel came to some private, startling realization that completely changed how he viewed the world, and he kept those eyes trained on my finger like it was a snake poised to strike at any moment. Regardless, I felt like the father of the year and sent Daniel back out to play with a juice box and a pat on his head that seemed to make him tense up. As he walked back outside, slower and somehow even quieter than he had come in, I privately wondered if he might have autism and went back to the TV. Life with Daniel became much harder from that point on. My son had become an utter germaphobe, refusing to play outside, washing his hands and toys constantly, and even refusing hugs and bedtime kisses from his mother or I. Eventually, Daniel would stop eating most food, saying his former favorite meals were icky if they had the wrong coloration or texture. Soon after, he would stop letting his friends come over, and when he started to refuse to go to school, we had to get professionals involved. The doctor said it was the worst case of mysophobia she had ever seen. It was as if Daniel could see the microscopic life crawling on every surface, like the world was some alien and hostile place, and it was agony for him to exist within it. We had to pull Daniel out of school completely when we realized we couldn't keep dragging him out of the house every day and answering calls from teachers about the panic attacks he'd have in the classroom. It only got worse from there, as we had to start vacuum sealing Daniel's twice-daily laundry loads, wrapping all the furniture in plastic wrap, and wiping down every surface before and after touching it. I had given up all of my previous hopes of molding my son into the kind of man I wanted him to be, as Daniel was now more comfortable with the harsh smell of chemical cleaners than he was with fresh air. I tried everything in a failed attempt to fix my son. I tried understanding. I tried discipline. I have spanked him once or twice. Clearly, nothing was working. But in one last attempt to get him out of what I thought was a prolonged phase, I went out and bought a cat. Daniel was about 11 at the time. I thought the animal would give Daniel some much-needed attention and affection outside of his parents, and that his love for the animal would trump his fear of germs. After all, if our new cat could clean himself with his tongue and be fine, then Daniel could certainly exist in the real world without his plastic sheets and hand sanitizer. Hell, if nothing else, the inclusion of a litter box in the house should force him out of his comfort zone. Daniel was immediately opposed to the intrusion into his germ-free sanctuary and refused to spend any time whatsoever with the animal. I, however, appreciated the sense of normalcy the cat brought into our shrink-wrapped house, even if now Daniel would refuse to come out of his room. Maybe more so because of it. You can imagine my fear then when the cat went missing, followed by my complete surprise when Daniel said the cat was in his room. He seemed more chipper than usual and kept talking about how much he loved the new pet and how soft his fur was. I thought my plan had worked and left well enough alone, letting Daniel keep the cat in his room for a while if it meant he was getting over his phobia. It took me about a week to realize that the cat's food bowl wasn't emptying and that I hadn't physically seen him since Daniel had taken him to his room. I wanted what was best for Daniel, but I couldn't escape the feeling in my gut that something was wrong. So I confronted him, asking to see the cat. He seemed nervous at first, but after I sternly asked him again, he let me into his room. I was immediately on edge when Daniel didn't just bring the cat to me, and stepping into his room didn't help the feeling at all. His room was just as eerily clean as the last time I had seen it. Everything neatly folded and tucked away and literally shining as the light reflected off plastic sheets. It was too clean for a boy's room, I thought, and certainly too tidy for a cat to have been living in here for the better part of a week. I knew something was wrong. I asked Daniel where the cat was, and his usual silence did little to assuage my fears. He had that look on his face that kids have, where they know they're about to be in trouble, but they aren't totally sure why. I asked him again, and it became clear to me why he'd have his doubts. The final insistence. Daniel opened the sliding door to his closet. At the bottom of a row of neatly stacked shelves, Daniel pulled out a large, black shoebox and held it by his feet as he looked up at me, as if trying to judge by my expression if he was going to be in trouble or not. My heart started pounding. I immediately began to worry about the cat, my cat. Was Daniel confining him to sleeping in this little shoebox? Was he just pretending to have grown on the cat this whole time and was trying to keep him from wandering around, spreading germs all over Daniel's perfect plastic-wrapped house? Has he gone the whole week without eating? I was even starting to worry that the cat had died in some kind of accident or been starved by Daniel unintentionally, and he was trying to hide the evidence from me. Nothing could have prepared me for when Daniel opened the box, showing me my cat, perfectly, motionlessly preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag. "I made him clean," Daniel said, a tinge of hope that I might understand in his voice. "He's perfect like this." Daniel and I were never close after that. His visits to the shrink doubled in frequency, and he started to shut off from the world as I shut off from him. His germophobia and oppressive cleaning rituals only got worse until my parents agreed that it would be best if they took Daniel in when he turned 15. A father should never say this about his son, but I felt nothing but relief when he was gone. If his grandparents hadn't taken him in, I don't know if his mother and I could have stayed together. I wouldn't see much of Daniel again until the death of my parents. Mom lasted a few years after Dad went, both of them passing under Daniel's care. Daniel was 22 now and looked gaunt and pale, like he had been a prisoner somewhere. His hair looked choppy, like he was cutting it himself, and whenever he sat down he did it with his knees tucked into his chest. He wouldn't even leave the house for the funeral, and the police told me Daniel had been locked in the house for 3 weeks with his grandmother's body before someone found them, too afraid to leave the house or invite anyone in. Without a job, Daniel couldn't afford to keep living on his own. Feeling bad for him, I took him back under my roof, as any father would. I had hoped his fear of the invisible everything around him had died down a bit in the years he spent away from his enabling parents, but some part of me knew better as soon as Daniel was back in our lives. So were his oppressive sterilization rituals, wiping, wrapping, and wiping again everything in sight. The time Daniel had spent away had only made his habitual cleansing worse, to the point where my home was all but covered in an ineffectual snail trail of slimy hand sanitizer and antibacterial creams. I remember feeling sick to my stomach every time I heard him vacuum sealing his laundry in the other room. The smell of bleach and harsh chemical cocktails became too much to handle, despite Daniel's constant need to keep the germs out. My wife's once dismissible health problems became exasperated until she could hardly get out of bed on her own. I started to feel sick myself, whether if from the constant chemical fumes or just weakness of spirit. I lacked the strength to fight back against Daniel's invasion of our home. It was like being in the hospital with some terminal illness, too weak to fight and surrounded by that disgustingly fake smell of cleanliness that just reminds you of death. I finally had the strength to stand up to Daniel when I found him putting something in our food. He stammered on about how it would keep us all clean and pure, and I wouldn't hear it. I snapped at him, shouting that if I ever caught him doing something like that again to his mother's food or mine, I would throw him out myself. Daniel shot me a glance, and I quickly recognized it as the same timid look of realization he had given my germ-covered finger way back during our science experiment. It was as if in that moment I became part of that dirty, unsafe world he saw everywhere else. At this point, I didn't care. I had enough, and I was ready to kick Daniel out for good. He was a grown man, and it was time he learned to live on his own. I was determined that I'd no longer be the enabling, weak father who had let his delusions come this far, and that I'd force him to face the real world for his own good and for the good of his family. Then, COVID happened. The whole nation was forced into lockdown, and our household was no different. As soon as the news broke, Daniel insisted on social distancing, quarantining within our own home, everything. At this point, I couldn't physically remove him from my home, and so I gave in. Daniel's controlling tidiness took over the home, and I became sicker and weaker and gave up on the idea of stopping him. He designated my marital bedroom as the quarantine for my wife and assigned me to the living room, where it started to feel like I was growing into the couch. The peak of the COVID-19 pandemic passed, as did an additional year or two. I started to lose track, spending my days in a sick daze as Daniel, in his face mask and starched gloves, was the intermediary between my wife and I. As I became weaker and more dependent on Daniel, I actually started to convince myself that I was grateful for him, that I'd be helpless if my son wasn't around. When I could, I'd press my ear up to the bedroom door, hear my wife's labored breathing, and it would remind me that gratitude was wasted. One day, the breathing stopped. Some part of me knew what had happened on the day it happened, but I remained in denial for as long as I could. I refused to leave the living room, or even go near that side of the house, terrified of a reminder that I couldn't hear her breathing. Daniel had stopped going into the room as well, which only further amplified my distress. Knowing that she wasn't being brought any more meals still wasn't enough to shake my paralyzed, fearful denial of her death. Until Daniel went back into the room, it still wasn't enough to break my delusion. Hell, it actually made me start to hope that I was wrong, and that my wife was still very much alive in there, somehow, being cared for by our son. When I heard the muffled sounds of electric humming, I knew something wasn't quite right, but I still didn't break from my daze. I let myself lay there, shivering from the feverish cold, hoping my wife was okay. Then, I heard the familiar sound of the vacuum. I pulled myself from my spot on the couch and pressed my ear to the bedroom door. I listened, still too afraid to cross the threshold. I heard the sound of the shower running and the electrical throbbing hum of power tools much louder in this vicinity. I still didn't act until finally I heard the chilling sound of the vacuum cleaner once again, remembering the family cat. My cat, still and lifeless and eerily preserved in that plastic bag. I pushed the door open and stumbled into the room. It was dark and dank, smelling much more like the sick than the rest of the house. It was clear from the rank odor that hung heavy in the air that my wife had not left this room in the years since we started quarantine, and the thought alone made me almost as sick as the smell. Somehow, it all felt like my fault. I had somehow made her sick. I had locked her in this awful home and barricaded her from getting the help she needed. Somehow, I had even poisoned the air. And in that moment, I was convinced that I had killed her. I heard the sound of the power tools again, coming from the attached master bathroom. Even in the dark, it wasn't hard to make out the heavy, dark trail of something visceral leading from the bed into the bathroom. I covered my face with my shirt and stumbled, bracing my weight on the nightstand as I moved towards the bathroom door. It was cracked open, letting in a single beam of light that revealed the trail leading up to be the darkest, sickest shade of red. I paused just before the door, listening again as the sound of a power tool, clearly to me now a saw, running just on the other side of the door. I was scared, more scared than I had ever been in my life, and I stood there paralyzed and convinced that I should just leave it alone. If I hadn't heard that vacuum again, I don't think I ever would have opened that door. The first thing I saw was Daniel, down on one knee, wrapped in a plastic poncho and with a dust mask over his face. He looked up at me in shock, and I couldn't help but notice the contrast between how sterile and perfect his outfit was and how gaunt and pale and inhuman he looked, like some broken thing of a boy. Both he and the bathroom were covered in plastic sheets, stained with red splatter that touched the ceiling and pooled on the floor. Then, I saw my wife, or what was left of her, slumped in the corner of the shower. Parts of her were missing. I could make out jagged and uneven cuts in her arms and legs and even her breasts, which were nothing compared to the sucking wound on her neck where her head used to be. It makes me sick even thinking about it. She didn't even look like a human being anymore, but like some mangled doll chewed up by a dog. The shower was running over her naked, desecrated body, washing her blood down the tub's drain. I swear I could hear it gargle and moan as it struggled to wash down. The sickest part of all wasn't my wife's humiliated, tarnished corpse. It wasn't my son, covered in his mother's blood like some sick parallel to his birth. It's what he was doing with the parts of her that were missing. I glanced down and to my horror saw my wife's arm, foot, and head all tightly wrapped in vacuum-sealed bags. Daniel had the vacuum tube in his hand and had just finished wrapping his mother's breast in another bag of its own. Every time I close my eyes, I still see her face, tightly wrapped in plastic like it was a second skin. Her mouth and eyes were open, suction molded around the thin barrier of her airtight coffin like she was screaming for release. "Dad," Daniel whimpered, a begging tone in his voice like he needed, desperately, to be understood. He sounded again like a child who had been caught doing something they knew they were in trouble for. And before he could even say anything, I was shaking my head, clenching my eyes shut against the tears that poured through. I made her clean. I made her perfect. It's been 2 weeks, and Daniel has since been arrested. A murder investigation is still underway, but they say they're at least going to charge him with desecration of a corpse. I've been staying in a hotel since the incident. They tell me the house is most likely going to be condemned, but I don't care. I can't ever step another foot into that place. I felt physically better, less sick since I left, but mentally it feels like something's changed and it won't ever be better. Through it all, I blame myself. I truly hate Daniel for everything he's done to us, ever since he was a boy, but I can't help but feel like it was my fault that he became what he was. I know it was. I saw that obsession and paranoia form, all thanks to my meddling with his development. I saw the moment in his eyes when he stopped being my son and became whatever he was. I don't know what I'll do from here. My wife is dead, and the thing that used to be my son is probably going to prison. I wanted to be the perfect father, but I accidentally flipped that switch and turned my little boy into a monster. I'm making this post partially because I needed to get this off my chest, but also to warn all the parents out there to be careful how and what they teach their children. You might have a Daniel of your own, and who knows what'll flip that switch.